Hello again. In this lesson, we'll start with getting more familiar with the various windows in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition. We'll work with many of the standard user interface controls from the toolbox, and then finally, we'll modify the properties of those controls to change the way that they appear and behave within our applications. Now, throughout this series of lessons, I'll be referring to this program's user interface as an IDE. An IDE stands for Interactive Development Environment. It's a genre of software that assists you in creating your own programs. Now, there's lots of IDEs out there depending on the vendor and the programming language, but if you want to create C# applications, then Visual C# 2005 Express Edition is the default IDE, especially as you're getting started. Now, as you advance, maybe you're part of a team in a corporate environment, your company might supply you with either Visual Studio 2005 Professional or an even more advanced version that integrates with Team System. And that's a little down the road at this point, but I wanted you to understand what an IDE is and the relationship between Visual C# 2005 Express Edition and its bigger brothers, Visual Studio 2005 and Visual Studio Team System. A good IDE will provide lots of tools that help you create applications more easily. Now, in the previous example in Lesson 1, we just dragged and dropped a button control from the toolbox and we dropped it on the Visual Designer. And what we saw on the Designer service looked exactly like what the form would look like when the end user would run our application. We didn't have to write code to draw the form. We didn't have to make it the correct size and position on the screen. We didn't write code to position the button on the screen, but something wrote that code, because virtually everything you do in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition, whether you realize it or not, is writing code for you. Also, when we double-clicked on the button to write the code to display the message box, the act of double-clicking on the button generated code, if you'll recall from the previous lesson. And these are just a few examples of how the IDE helps you to write applications much faster than if you were to just try to type all the code in yourself into, let's say, Notepad, for example, into a text file, and then try to compile it manually, which you can do. There are many, many tools and windows in Visual C# 2005. Now, some help you write code or configure aspects of your application. Some tools help you find your mistakes. Some tools help you search and locate code that you've already written. But all these tools have to appear somewhere on your screen at some point so you can interact with them in some way. And Microsoft has done a pretty good job of putting these tools in clever places so that they only appear when you need them, and then they get lost when you need them to get out of your way. So let's get started by creating a new project, and we'll call it Lesson 02, and we learned how to do this in the previous lesson. Now that we have our project, I want to demonstrate how to work with the windows that will appear within the IDE. So for example, let's take a look at the toolbox. Notice that whenever I hover my mouse cursor over the toolbox on the left-hand side, that it jumps out so that I can find the control I need and drag it to my designer surface. But what if I needed to drag over 10 or 15 controls because I'm building my form? I'd have to go through this tedious process of dragging control, dropping on the design surface. Since the toolbox window disappears, I have to go through that process again of waiting for a second or two for it to jump out, visually find the control I need. And so the process is a little bit stilted, and what I would prefer is to have that window always visible so that I can do my work and not cover up any of the form on the right-hand side and not have to lose sight of all the controls that are in the toolbox. And then to do that, what I need to do is disable the auto hide. And so in the title bar here, I can use this little pin icon and pin the window down. That removes the auto hide. The window is now docked into place on the left-hand side. And notice that it no longer covers up our form, and I can drag and drop controls very easily. And when I'm finished, all I need to do is click the auto hide button again to enable it, and now it has gone back to its original state. Also, what I can do, if I don't like the placement of the toolbox there, I can select the title bar and hold down with my left mouse button and then drag that window out of place and just drop it anywhere on screen. And so it's out of my way so that I can do some work or whatever the case might be. And when I'm finished, all I need to do is drag it back into place wherever I want it. I can put it against the top side, the right side, the bottom, leave it somewhere in the middle, or return it back to its original spot. Now, as you see, whenever I'm dragging this window around, I get these little visual helpers to help me determine exactly where the window will be whenever I drop it into place. So if I wanted to dock it back here against the left-hand side, I just slowly move my mouse cursor with the window over here to the left, and I can see now that when I put my mouse over this little cursor on the left-hand side, I get a blue representation of where that window will wind up. And that's perfect. That's where I want to drop it. So now I'm going to release the mouse cursor, and it's back into place. And I can resize the window by slowly using my mouse cursor until it changes to this little move icon, which allows me to move it out to the right or back to the left to resize it correctly. And just a word of caution here, you can only move a window around like I did just a moment ago if it's already pinned down, if the auto hide is turned off. Now on the right hand side, I have two visible windows that each share about half the available space. On the top I have the Solution Explorer, on the bottom I have the Properties window. Now we've already talked about the Solution Explorer in the previous lesson. In this lesson we're going to talk about the Properties window. But before we do that, we can see that each of these windows are docked and pinned down on the right hand side. Now since I'm running at a fairly small screen resolution, it might be difficult for me to be able to see all the properties in the Properties window and still have the Solution Explorer available. So what I can do is select the title bar of the Properties window, and then, just like I did with the toolbox a moment ago, drag it and then find the icon that best represents how I want this to be displayed in the IDE. And you can see here that this middle cursor would be what I want. I want it to take up the entire screen. So now what I have is a Properties tab at the bottom and a Solution Explorer tab on the right. So I can tab back and forth between multiple windows. So this is great when you have to have these windows readily available, but you don't want them both visible at the same time, or it's not necessary. And often I'll have the windows on this right-hand side split with 2 or 3 tabs on the top and then 2 or 3 tabs on the bottom. So you have a lot of flexibility here. Now in order to get this back in place and put the Properties window back where we started, what I have to do is go to the Properties tab here at the bottom, and click it and hold down and then select this little bottom icon and drop it into place, and then I'm back where I started. Now we've only talked about the windows on the left and the right. However, there are windows that have an affinity for a more horizontal alignment, such as the errors list that's available here at the bottom. Now if we had any problems within our application, they would be displayed here for us to modify and fix. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on within the next lesson, the next couple of lessons. But this window basically works the same way, but because of the data that it contains, kind of in a grid fashion, we have a description, file, line, column, project, and those are fairly spread out pieces of information. It has an affinity towards a more horizontal perspective, but we don't have to leave it that way. We can still drag it. Well, first of all, we need to pin it down, and then we can drag it over here with the Properties window. Find the right spot. I didn't get it exactly in the right spot, but you can see though that since there's so much information and it's kind of crowded, that this isn't the best place for the error list. So I'm going to pull it out of place and put it back here at the bottom, and then turn on the auto hide, and it's back where we started from. Now if I don't even need the error list anymore, what I can do is select this little close button in the right hand side of the title bar, and it's permanently gone. It's not available anymore when I hover my mouse cursor down near the bottom of the screen. To get it back, or to get back any of the windows that you may have accidentally closed down or closed down purposely but now you need them back, what you can do is go to the View menu, and there's a list of the typical windows that you'll find, as well as a list of supplemental windows that you can also make available on your in your IDE. In this case, I want to get the errors list back, and notice that it's back where we started from. Let's go ahead and let it be auto hide. Okay, so that should be enough for now. Let's move on to learning more about creating cool user interfaces with our WinForm applications. Now, we already saw from the previous lesson that if you want to take a control from the toolbox and place it onto your designer surface, all you need to do is drag and drop into place. But there's also another way to do this. All you need to do is find the control that you want and double-click it in the toolbox, and it will appear on your form. In this particular case, this control covers up the one behind it, so what I'll need to do is use my mouse cursor and get this cross arrow here, and then click down and hold and drag it into place wherever I want to on my form. Also, the toolbox has its controls arranged by their type. So, for example, all the dialog controls are together, all the printing controls are together. And you can see what I'm doing here in collapsing these controls and then expanding them by clicking this little plus and minus button. So this is a great way to get them out of your way if you're not going to be using those controls. And what I want to use in the rest of the video is the common control. So I'm just going to put them into place here, and then I have ready access to these and yet not be affected by the rest of the controls that are in my toolbox. Also, once you have a control on your designer surface, as you can see from before, I can move it around, or I can resize the control by using one of the little handles on any of the corners of the control and then clicking down, holding, and expanding or contracting it just like I would a window in Windows XP, for example. So I can make it any size that I want to, move it to a different spot, and so on. But if you really want to change how your control looks or how it functions, you're going to have to write some code. The question is, do you have to type in all the code yourself? Well, not always, and that's where the Properties window comes in. The Properties window allows us to change the properties, how the control appears, maybe its text, its color, its size. We can control how it functions. Can it be dragged and dropped? Can it be resized as the form is resized? Should it be disabled? And a lot more. Each control has some common properties, but each control has a few properties that are unique to just that particular control. And that's what makes each control important in your toolbox. But the good news is that you can count on certain properties to be common across all the controls. It's then just a matter of what makes them each a little bit different and learning their strengths and weaknesses. And that just takes a little bit of time and practice, but you'll pick it up quickly. And like I mentioned earlier in this lesson, every time you make a change in the Properties window, behind the scenes the IDE is making a change to the underlying code. And later in this lesson, I'll show you where that actually happens. So let's just take a quick aside and play around with the button control, just to illustrate some of the common properties that are across most of the controls that we'll work with. And since I'm going to be using the Properties window a lot, I'm going to actually try to put this here so we can see a lot more of the properties that are available and drag it out. Okay, so let's do this. The first thing that we can do is change the width and the height. To change that, we'll go down to the size property, and we're going to expand that property so that we can see the actual width and the height. You can see here that it has a width of 118, that's pixels, and a height of 107. So I can change this to say, let's go 150 width, and notice that it got bigger, and change the height to just 40. So we can make it wide but not very tall. The next thing that we'll do is change the top and the left by changing the location. So you can see it's an X and Y coordinate. Again, this is the X and Y coordinate from the top left-hand corner of the window. So to change the X, let's go ahead and put that to something like 30. And then put the Y to something like 120. So now we've moved it from about this location a little bit up and a little bit over to the left. The next thing that we could do and that we need to do for all of our controls is give it a name. Now by default, each control that you place will have a default name followed by a number, and that number will increment for each control that you put on. So if I were to add another button, it would be called button 3. But you should change the names of these buttons to give them something a little bit more meaningful, because if you need to refer to them while you're typing code, it would be better to have something more memorable. It's just a good common standard practice to undertake. So let's change this to something like OK button, or OK button, probably the more proper form. And then let's change the text that appears on this button. So let's scroll up here and go to the text. Notice that it's still, by default, button 2. Even though the name has changed, the text on that button has not changed. And so we'll type in the words OK. Next, let's take a look at the back color. We can change the back color and the fore color. Now, by default, it's going to use a system color. So whatever the user's system colors are, there will be a palette of colors available here. So if, for example, they change in Windows XP or one of the previous version of Windows, their color scheme, it will always conform to that color scheme. But we can override that by selecting a custom color, and for example, let's change it to something like this little purple color. And then we can change also the fore color, which will affect the font color by doing the same thing. And here we might pick something like dark blue, and it's very hard to see because the font is so small. So let's go ahead and change the font to something a little bit bigger. I'm going to expand the font properties. I'm going to change the font itself. Oh, let's change it to something kind of neat. I don't know what we have on our system here. Let's change it to Arial Black, and let's change its size to something like 14. And we can make it bold and italicized and so on. Okay, now that we've created a pretty funky button, you might be tempted to put a lot of your personality into your applications. However, there are some best practices that you should follow when learning about building user interfaces. A best practice is something that you'll hear about a lot as you become more experienced in programming. It's a tried and true method that many people who have come before you have either had success with or have failed at. So it's like learning from people's successes and failures. There's an old saying that I love. It's any fool can learn from his own mistakes, but a wise man learns from the mistakes of others. And that's very true in many areas of life, and it's true for the software developer as well. And I'll give you 3 quick best practices for user interface design that'll get you a long way. And keep in mind that there are entire books written on this subject, so while you won't be an expert at the end of this lesson, you'll have a couple of guidelines to get you started. The first best practice is to think in terms of columns and rows. When arranging your controls, try to make sure that they follow a logical pattern. If you're building a data entry form or a form that allows users to change the properties of your applications, attempt to keep the labels in one column on the left and keep the controls where the data will be entered on the right. And keep the action buttons like OK, Apply, and Cancel in the lower right-hand corner of the form. Second, stay with the standard fonts and colors. Yes, we've all been there before. We all want to be creative and pick colors that'll really jump out at the user instead of that old gray or tan color. However, your applications will probably look a lot more professional if you just keep them simple, using the standard colors and the standard fonts. True, some consumer or media applications like Windows Media Player, for example, have very cool skins. So it depends on your audience to some degree and the type of application you're trying to build. But by sticking to the standards, your end user is going to have some level of familiarity with how your program operates. Because, after all, it looks like other applications the user has already worked with. And this is a big plus in terms of the usability of your application. Third and finally, use standard or descriptive names for your controls. And this applies especially to controls like buttons or labels. Stick with OK rather than do it or go. Be simple and succinct in your labels. Don't try to be too funny or too cute. don't make your users think too hard. Again, this hampers the ability of your end users to understand how your program is intended to be used. There's a lot more that I could say, but let's move on. Let's take a quick tour of about a dozen of the most important controls that you're going to find yourself using on just about every project that you work on. In fact, we're going to use most of these controls in our RSS Reader project at the end of this series of lessons. Okay, so I've deleted the controls off the designer surface from the previous example so I could demonstrate the creation of a fictitious customer service or sales inquiry application. So it won't really do anything, but it'll give us a way to introduce some of the common controls in a very common scenario. Okay, so I'll get started by adding a couple of buttons to the designer surface, and you'll recall from our previous lesson that buttons are used in order to tell the application that the user wants to take some action. So in this particular case, we want to add an OK and cancel button. You can see here I'm changing the text property of each of those buttons. And then the next thing I want to do is add some labels. Now, labels are used to put information, kind of like helper text on the screen, and they're often used to put some sort of description to the left side of an input area. So let's add about 4 or 5 of those. And we'll make them look a little bit better in just a moment here. Let's go ahead and lay some things out here. So here we'll put customer name. Here we'll put service representative. Put product interested in, and we'll also capture their gender, male or female. Okay, we can kind of move these around a little bit to get into place. So the next thing that we want to add is a text box control, and this allows our users to put any free-form text that they want to. And we'd want to only use these for, let's see if we can find it here. There we go, text box. We want to use these for situations where there's an endless number of possibilities, like customer name. Now, these are not good controls for things like states or countries, where there's a fixed number of correct answers. So let's go ahead and size that out. The next control we'll take a look at is a checkbox. A checkbox allows us to ask a yes or no question. So in this particular case, we'll ask whether or not the user wants us to send a catalog. Now, we might have multiple catalogs available from our company, and so we can also use checkboxes in a scenario where you have multiple selections and more than one can be true. So maybe they want us to send all of the catalogs that are available. We could use 3, 4, 5 checkboxes in that scenario to allow the selection of one or more checkboxes or one or more catalogs. And a control that looks a lot like the checkbox is a radio button. And the radio button is really meant for multiple choice selections where only one selection can be true. So in this particular situation, you can either only be male or female. So what we'll do is use male and then put female here. And notice also that these controls, the checkbox and the radio buttons, have their own labels associated with them. Now, we could clear out the value for male or female or send catalog, for example, and just add our own label to that, but it's more convenient just to use the one that's included in with that control. The next control we'll use is a list box, and a list box will display several different possible values, and depending on how the list box is configured, the user can either select one or multiple values in the list box. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the list box is that yes, it's also used for multiple choice, just like the radio buttons or the checkbox. But the radio buttons, for example, take up a lot of space because every time you add a new option, you have to add a new radio button, and so if you had 5, 10 options, you can imagine how much space that would take up on your form. The difference between those and a list box is that whenever you add more items to the list box, they just continue to be added to the bottom of a list that may not be visible, and if there are too many items, then a little scroll bar will appear on the right hand side, which will allow the user to scroll down or scroll up. Surely you've seen these either on websites or in other applications that you've used. But at any rate, the last interesting thing about the list box is that it has one of these little common task arrows off to the right hand side, and we haven't seen this yet in any of the controls that we've used. And the common tasks allows you to have some shortcuts to help speed you through the development process. In the case of this particular control, you can edit items or data bind the control to a data source. And we'll talk about data binding much later in this series of lessons. But for any rate, I'm going to click the Edit Items link here at the bottom of this Common Task window. And it allows me to input a static list of items. And I have to add one to each on a separate line of this little box here. So I'm going to add some fictitious items from our catalog that our customer might be interested in. The next control we'll use is called a combo box. And a combo box is kind of a cross between a text box and a list control. And what it allows you to do is create a list of items that the user can select from, just like the list box. But it also, if none of those items fit, then the user can type in a value that's not in that list. So it saves space by looking more like a text box, but yet still having a drop-down list that's available to the user to display multiple possible items. But it has the benefit of a list box in so much that it can be configured to only select one of the items in the list, so it can take up a little bit less space. It too has one of these common task little windows that pop up so that we can add items, and so we can put Bob, Beth, our customer service representatives. The next control that we'll add is a menu strip. So we'll have to actually get out of our common controls and go to the menus section within our toolbox and drag and drop a menu strip onto our designer surface. Now a menu strip allows you to have, just like the menu in this application, a list of selections that can be made in order to configure or in some ways change the operation of the application. What you can do here is type in your own list of items, for example, File, and then I can, if I want to create a submenu, create an item underneath of it called Open, Existing File, and I can go on from there, Exit, and so on. The other thing I can do is use the Common Tasks pop-up window and select this Insert Standard Items, and it'll give us the standard items that are found in most applications. For example, Edit, Tools, Help, and so on. And we can just delete this one if we'd like to. And you can see that it even gives us the little icons on the left-hand side, and then we can create events for each one of these selections that the end user might make. So we would double-click this, for example, to be able to write code that allows this information to be saved, or write code behind this click event so that if somebody clicks this menu item, that it'll create a new customer inquiry form, or whatever the case might be. And we'll talk more about handling events in the next video. But here we have a nice, neat little menu that we can use. Additionally, let me move this down so we can get to our next control. So the next control that we'll use is also found in the Menus and Toolbox section, and that is the tool strip, and we're going to drag and drop that into place underneath the menu. And a tool strip allows you to have a set of icons that will enact the most popular events within your application. Just like in any Windows application, you'll see that there's a list of toolbar items near the top, usually underneath the menu for just about every application that you work with. And so all we need to do to add items to this tool strip is to just click that down arrow and then select the type of item that we want to add. Most commonly we're going to select a button, but we also have some other choices like just a label. We can put a combo box here. We can also put a progress bar, and there are several others that we can choose from. But most often we'll use this again to use some graphical icons to represent something that some action that we'll need to take within our application. And so to change the actual graphical value, what we'll do is select this individual button as opposed to the entire tool strip. So now I have the caret, the selection around the entire tool strip, and I just want to select one item in particular, this particular button on that tool strip. And I'm going to change the image. I'm going to click the little ellipsis here. And what I'm going to do is select a local resource and click Import. Now, if you have already unpacked the code.zip file that we talked about in the previous lesson, then you can find some example icons in the Lesson 2 folder under Icons. And you're going to have to drill down a little bit, again to Lesson 2 and again to Icons. And so there's some available icons here. I'm going to click Waste and select OK, and you can see we have a little waste paper basket icon here within our form, within our label. We can also select this particular item within our tool strip and change the text. Something like click these buttons, something nonsensical. The next control that we'll want to use, and we're going to make a little space for it here, is a status strip. So I'm going to drag and drop that from the toolbox here. And a status strip allows you to send messages to your user at the bottom of the form. It even allows you to insert like a little status bar, which can inform the user of the progress of some long-running task. So all I need to do is, first of all, I can put a status label, so I can update this label as my application is running, much like the way that you'll see most Windows applications, including Visual C# 2005 Express Edition, has one of these as you're performing operations. We can also add a little progress bar and some other things as well. Now there's one other control I want to call your attention to because we're going to use it in our RSS Reader application later in the series of videos, and that is the tool strip container. And the tool strip container is a great control that hosts other controls like the menu strip, the tool strip, and the status strip. So if you've ever used Microsoft Word 2003, you can drag anything, a menu, a toolbar, whatever it is, and dock it against another side. And let me show you this, how you can do this in Word. I'm not going to take the time to do this in our application because we'd have to delete everything off, put down the tool strip container first, and then put everything back on. So that might be too time intensive, but I'm going to show you how it works in Microsoft Word. And so we have, for example, here this toolbar, and I can drag it off and then dock it against the left-hand side or dock it against the right-hand side or the bottom. And it's that tool strip container that we have that in Visual C# that would allow us to do essentially the same sort of thing and give us the ability to arrange our icons any way we like. Okay, so we've covered some of the basic controls and some of the different ways to set their properties, and we could take some time here to clean up our little form and make the spacing a little bit better. It wouldn't take very long to do that, but we'll come back to all these controls several times over the course of the next few lessons in order to illustrate some specific coding concepts. And little by little, you're going to begin to learn even more about these controls. It just takes a little bit of practice. So. Let's continue on, though. I've got a few tips that I want to share with you, things that you can do that will make your life a little bit easier. And the first tip that I've stressed a couple of times, but I'll elaborate on, be sure that you have the correct control selected before you start changing things about it in the Properties window. And this is sometimes a gotcha for those people who are new to an IDE like this. So if you're not sure what's selected, or you're having a hard time selecting the right control because they're so close together, you can actually go into the Properties window and select the item that you want to change. So all you got to do is find its name, for example, like label 2. And when I do that, notice that now the caret is around, the selection caret is around label 2, and I can change any of the properties. But you have to make sure that whichever item is selected is the one that you actually want to work on. You can double check it by taking a look at what's listed in this combo box here under the Properties window. There's actually another good way to do this as well. You go to View, Other Windows, and select Document Outline. And this will let you see all of the controls kind of in a hierarchical fashion. So, for example, if you have a control that contains other controls, like the menu strip, for example, you can see not only the menu strip, but it's the items that are underneath that menu strip, the File menu, and then the New button underneath that, the file entry, and so on. So you can see in a hierarchical way and select each item that you want to make a change to. So I can select label 2, for example, then go back over to my Properties window and trust that I'm working with the correct control. The next tip is that your users are going to want to use the Tab button on their keyboards to navigate in a logical sequence from field to field so that they don't have to take their hands off the keyboard in order to enter information. So by default, whenever you add controls to your form, each control will be assigned a tab order. Take a look at the tab order property for each of these controls. Let's see, this one has a tab index of 6. This one has a tab index of 11, and so on. So these may not be in the correct order, and so you'll find your users jumping from maybe a top position to a bottom position to a left position, and so on. It's not very logical. So you're going to need to change the tab index. Now, we could definitely go in and just change the tab index property and start at 0 and work our way down from the upper left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner of the form. But there's actually an easier way to do this, a little more automated. So let's take a look at View, Tab Order, and when I do, notice that there's a series of buttons that appear on our form, little numbers. And so I can change the order that the user will tab through the application. So whenever this form comes up, the first thing that I want them to do is enter the customer name. So I'm going to click on that, and when I do, it changes the color from blue to white and changes the number from whatever it was to the number 0, which will be the first item. So our cursor will automatically show up in that text box. The next thing I want to happen is when they click their tab button to go to the service representative combo box. So I click on that for number 1, and I'll just continue the sequence, 3, 4, and so on until I click on every control and change the tab order. So I may want to start back then up here at the top and continue on from there. In order to get out of this, I'm going to select tab order again, and it'll all disappear. Now, like I indicated just a moment ago, you generally want to arrange your items on your form from start in the upper left-hand corner and then progress in a logical way to the bottom right-hand corner. So keep that in mind whenever you're designing your applications and the flow of the tabbing. The final trick for now that I'm going to show you is how to line up your controls in a very clean sort of way. Now, we've already looked at the fact that with your controls, and when you move them around, you get these little blue guidelines that'll help you align a control close to the relative position of other controls on your form. But there's also another way to do this. Say, for example, I have these two controls that are out of alignment, and I want to make sure that they're all relatively aligned in the same fashion. There's something called a layout toolbar that's available, and if you don't already have it visible whenever you're in your design view, what you can do is come to some blank area in Visual C# 2005 Express Edition, right-click in any open area, and view the toolbars that are currently available. As you can see, I have the standard toolbar available. That's the top toolbar. And then I also have this layout toolbar available. And let me show you how to use that. But if you don't already have this on, you want to click this and make sure that there's a little check mark next to the word layout, and then that toolbar should appear in your toolbar area at the top of your IDE. Now what I need to do is select a couple of controls that I want to use this on. So I will start with this list box, and then I'm going to hold down the control button on my keyboard and start selecting other controls. So I'll select this control and this control as well. Now notice that the original control I selected, the list box, this will be the control that is used for comparison's sake. The other controls that I select secondarily and third after that, they have black control handles. Notice that this combo box and the text box both have little black handles. That lets me know that these are going to be the affected controls by whatever action that I take whenever I use my layout toolbar. So let's begin by using this first button over here on the left-hand side, the Align Lefts. And what that will do is align up all the controls with the black handles with the left side of the control that has the white control handles. So notice that it moved that combo box over to the right. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is use the Make Same Width button. So right now you can see that the text box and the combo box are just a little bit shorter than the list box. So to make them conform, I'm going to click this button and notice that they got a little bit wider. And there's a number of different of options that we have here. We can, for example, increase or decrease the vertical spacing. We can remove the vertical spacing altogether, and also the same would be true for the horizontal spacing, which is not really applicable in this case. But we can also center the controls horizontally or vertically. We can align their middles or align their tops, align their bottoms, align their rights, and so on. So there's a lot of options here. We can also enter our tab order from this little button on the layout as well. Let me turn that off right there. So we have a bunch of great options for laying out the controls on our form and a lot of power here, and we still haven't written any code to do anything meaningful. So we're going to start that in the next lesson. So if you enjoyed watching this video, please visit www.learnvisualstudio.net to download and watch over 400 videos just like this one, aimed at all skill levels on many different topics related to C#, Visual Basic.net, ASP.net, and more. Thank you.